So welcome to day 4 of our Inclusive Instruction Speaker Series. I know that there's been so much learning so far, and we're so excited to see some of the same faces that are back. So continuing to learn and continuing to develop. So we're just thrilled to have you here, and especially thrilled to have Shige Sakurai joining us today as well. Shige, I'm going to let you do an intro yourself, but I just want to quickly go to Dr. Snyder to do a little bit of level setting for the session.
Thank you so much. Again, also, I'd like to just welcome you all on day 4. Again, new faces, old faces, love to see it. So just to remind everyone around how this is going to work today, you all are on mute, and we'd like for you to stay on mute until our speaker invites you to be a part of the conversation. So this will be super interactive. You will see that. We do want to hear voices. We would love to see that chat again. Filled with questions and conversation. So continue to do that throughout this entire session today. And of course, feel free, because there won't be any PowerPoints or anything. So please feel free to use that speaker view to ensure that you can see Shige. And we're just, again, really excited to have you all here today. So Shige, if you want to get started.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. My name is Shige Sakurai. I go by they, them pronouns. I do work at University of Maryland serving as acting director in the LGBT Equity Center. I've been working on equity, diversity, inclusion issues, specifically around LGBTQ+ and intersectional social justice, professionally for the last 18 years, but as an activist and community organizer over the last 22 years. I have been on the adjunct faculty for the Smith School. I did my MBA at IE Business School in Madrid, Spain. And I'm just really excited to be with you all and to talk about intent versus impact today. And really my pedagogical approach to this is I want you to be engaged, interactive, and also teaching each other, right? We all have experiences that we have. We all have fragmentary knowledge and skills and experiences. And so how do we all help each other with sharing ideas, best practices, what has worked and not worked for us in different instances? So I look forward to this being a highly engaged session. So that's a little bit about me. I also I was the founder of International Pronouns Day and the author of mypronouns.org. And so I hope you might find some of those to be useful resources if you're thinking about issues around pronouns in the classroom or in meeting spaces. I also invite you to, if you want to change your name or add your pronouns, you can rename yourself in the participants tab. If it's something you want to do and make it more sticky so that it stays in your profile, you can also do that later under umd.zoom.us. When you go into your profile, you can actually edit it there and add pronouns or change how you want your name displayed. And your students can do that too. They may not be aware of that though, because many of them do not have a need to go into the web portal if they're just attending things and not scheduling things. So that may be something just to share if you're doing any online teaching or meetings or advising kinds of appointments. What I'd love for you to do to introduce yourselves, so I see names and so on in the participants tab, but I'm wondering if you can share in the chat with each other what is it that comes to mind when you think about intent versus impact, the title of this session. So a few of the responses: good intentions don't always have good impacts, the road to hell, and so forth. Plan versus result, strategies we can use to make an impact with our students. We need to recognize that regardless of what our intent was or is, the impact on the other person matters. You can have great intentions with very little impact, and then you versus others. So often when we're talking about intent versus impact, with intent, it's what you thought you were doing, right? And impact, though, is how is it received? How is it perceived by others? Or looking at it another way, it could be what someone else thought that they were doing and how you're receiving it, how you're perceiving it. And often this comes up in scenarios where there's been a critical incident of some kind and maybe it's caused some upset, right? Or some kind of pain or harm, potentially. Of course, there are other ways to explore these concepts that are not just about that. We'll do a little bit of that today, but we are a bit focused on sort of the critical incidents that can come up, and often why we are needing to center impact, particularly when we're addressing people's concerns. But I don't want to dismiss that intent can also matter. It's just that I don't think it matters sometimes in the ways that we think that it does. And so that will be something that we'll get into a little bit more. So I want to start talking a little bit about microaggressions as well. So that's my next question for you, is what is a microaggression? And so for this one, instead of typing in the chat, I'm wondering if somebody who feels like this is a term you're familiar with, how would you describe it? If you'd be willing to unmute or raise your hand and unmute and just share with us what do you perceive as the meaning of that word microaggressions?
To me, microaggressions are small, little, often what I refer to as throwaway actions that are often implicit. We don't realize that we're doing it, that have a much bigger impact on somebody else than they have on us. You know, it could be something as simple as if, you know, I'm walking into a building and a man sort of opens the door and holds it for me. Like, in the back of my head, sometimes I think, are they holding it for me because I'm a woman? Would they hold it for a guy that's coming behind me? And, you know, it makes me feel a little, you know, and people will say, oh, it's manners, it's Southern gentility, whatever it is, but it still makes me feel belittled a little bit. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you. That's a great example. So somebody holds the door and then you wonder about all the other power dynamics or identity dynamics that could be at play. And you're talking about, sometimes it's more the smallness of the action and not necessarily the smallness of the impact that is micro. And so we're talking about sometimes things that are subtle, sometimes things that are unintentional, or implicit in kind of how that we think and behave. Sometimes it is intentional, but it's usually the idea is that it's something small in terms of the behavior or the action. Yeah.
Like, also, one that I read really recently that resonates with me is that sometimes when men will move past you in a crowded space, they'll often put their hand on a woman's waist or on her back just to kind of gently push her out of the way. And like, you would never see them do that to their dude friends.
I'm seeing one question in the chat, which is just, I hold doors for anyone behind me. Is this now wrong? And I don't know that any of this is about like, so I'm thinking how I want to explain this. I don't have like, here's the list of do this and don't do that. That is not my intention in this conversation. I think the idea is to think about how different people perceive things, and what the impact of that can be. And so that's kind of where we'll get deeper into what some of the intention versus impact piece of it is. Because I think sometimes things that we think we're trying to be helpful or polite or whatever that it might be having an adverse impact on not maybe everyone, but maybe some people. That doesn't necessarily mean don't ever do that thing. It may really depend on the circumstance, and we can talk about some of that.
Yeah, because I if somebody holds the door open for me, I'm actually very happy. I don't have to touch the door.
Me too.
I'm actually appreciative of that.
Thank you. I was starting to think I was the only one. I was raised to do that despite whoever was behind me. It was just plain courtesy to leave the door open for them. I never even thought twice that someone would think it was a power struggle.
Yeah.
And as I was saying, I don't think that it's about a black and white yes or no necessarily. It might be on certain issues, but there may be other ones where there's this nebulousness. So sometimes the issue is not don't ever do a thing. It's more if somebody says, I'm concerned about this thing, how do we then respond to it? And so that's part of it, is that there may be other behaviors we want to change as more general practice. And then there may be other things that we want to think of how do we dress in the moment. And I have an example of that I'll bring up probably a little bit later. But I also see a hand up from Zainab, if you wanted to say something.
Yes, thank you so much. This is really interesting. Now, I don't have a comment on this. I would like to pick your brain on the following scenario and how you classify it. You're a woman in a meeting and you're being charged by the HR manager, and the HR manager would say, remember, to the chair of the committee, remember that you need to take diversity into consideration. You need to have certain number of women, certain number of underrepresented communities, etc., as part of your pool. And the chair of the committee looks at you and you say, yeah, we have her as a woman. What do you classify? How is this classified? In a very nice manner, of course. So, you know, the person will look at you and say, yeah, we've satisfied this. You know, we have a woman on the committee.
And I think this is I'm guessing that if you've experienced this scenario, you had some specific feelings.
I have not. I'm not going to say I've experienced it or not. I'm trying just to classify it. Where does it come under?
I mean, so honestly, I'm bringing up microaggression because I'm wanting to talk about not just things that people think of as big, intentional, like, oh, I was trying to be racist, and so therefore I was, or I was trying to be sexist, and so therefore I did this. But many times people are trying to be helpful, trying to answer a question that somebody said, oh, you need representation. And so I'm like, oh, so we have representation. So somebody in their head, maybe, I don't know, I don't pretend to know the intent of everyone. Maybe they thought, I'm just answering this question, right? Like somebody raised a question, I'm just pointing out like, this is representation right here. But how could that feel if you're that person? Or if you're even in that room witnessing it and thinking like, is this tokenization? Is this just this one person is supposed to be like all of representation of somehow minoritized groups? So there's lots of like things that can bring up that could be very triggering or heated. I'm not trying to get us into like a really academic, operationalized, how do we define this term in a way that I can use for research approach to like what is microaggression, because that might be macroaggression, mesoaggression. How you could think of it in lots of different ways. I think what I'll say to some of this is we'll keep talking about that. We'll get deeper in a few moments. I'm bringing it up because sometimes things that people think are really small. So like maybe you get my pronouns wrong. You know, maybe you call me she or you call me he instead of they, them. And what if I blow up about that? What if I'm like extremely, extremely angry and just like, I am just like, what, you know, like, and just so upset. And what I want people to be thinking about is that there's a lot happening like this, that we're talking about stuff now that can be obvious to some people and really under the surface for others. And there's this great differential in how we might interpret what's happening in a situation. And sometimes it doesn't really matter why something happened. It matters that it did, or that it's having this effect, right? And so one thing I wanted to point out is that sometimes there's a long history, right, of these kinds of things happening, how they're linked to identity or group status, how that that marginalizations, this is like, you know, some have called it like death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? Like these could be seemingly small. Oh, I just said, oh, you're representative of this, or, oh, I just held the door for you, or, oh, I just got your pronouns wrong. Okay, it's like these little actions. They weren't necessarily like, oh, I'm here to get you or to do something harmful. In fact, I could have been trying to be helpful. I thought it was good. And maybe it was an okay behavior, but in that context and in that moment and for the person receiving it, it didn't work. and why, right? And so some of it, part of what I'm trying to point out is I want people to be aware that there's also trauma, and there's history, and there's structural and power differentials that are happening, and that these larger systems and larger histories also play into how am I going to react. So maybe you got my pronouns wrong, and if I freaked out in front of you all about it, it might be also because that happens to me so many times, and I'm so tired of it, and it feels like erasure, and there are structural ways in which governments, policies, society don't want me to exist. And maybe I have a colleague or a friend who has been physically attacked for being trans, let's say. And it reminds me of that. Things that are much bigger than the small thing in that moment, or just the repeatedness of the small thing, is what I'm then thinking about. That's not necessarily your fault that I'm thinking about that. It's just that your action might have brought that about in my mind, right? So it's partly I'm wanting people to think microaggression can be important also because it can have a macro impact, but also because it's not always about you, right? So decentering that oh, I think that because this person reacted negatively to something I did, that it's always about me. And then it's about defending myself. So we go into these now I need to defend myself because it's somehow about me. I do see more hands, but I do need to continue, and I will try to leave some time for some Q&A as we get forward as well. So thank you for all of that. I'm actually very excited because this is much more questions and interaction than I thought might be possible. So I'm really glad to actually be here and have some of this conversation. So that's what I wanted to say about microaggression, is just that, yes, I agree with what has been said. Thank you for the questions, examples. I'll give another maybe one or two examples here. But yes, they are basically these daily, often commonplace things that could be slights or perceived as slights, and they could communicate hostility or erasure or negative attitudes about a marginalized group or a disempowered group. So one example, these are one or two examples from my own experience. I was once at a leadership, a retreat, and we were asked to line up. This is an icebreakery activity. We were line up in order of the year of the first car that you owned. So I guess my question would be, what could be wrong with that? Why could that have also been triggering for me? Or problematic for me?
Age.
Age, okay. How so?
Well, the year of your first car could be indicator of how old you are.
It could be. It might be something that you may not want to share. So some folks, thank you for that. And some folks are also sharing in the chat, maybe you never owned a car. Maybe it's a socioeconomic status issue. Or maybe you couldn't afford to own a car. So I was young at that time, and I was in a meeting with a lot of director level leaders in higher ed, and I was part of this group. And I was, I think, the only one who had never owned a car. I still have never owned a car. I'm 40, but part of that is living in DC, right? And the choices I've made about where I want to live that were not equal to other people in the same institution. And particularly at sort of the leadership level. And so there were subtle things that communicated, even though I'm certain that was never the intention, right? This activity wasn't about reveal something about yourself that's, difficult or anything like that. I have one other example, which is, this is actually from many years ago when I was a student, an undergrad student. We had a Spanish class. And we were asked to write down maybe the name of your best friend and then some words describing your friend, and then go around the classroom and try to find an ideal date for your friend based on these attributes. Why might, if folks can put in the chat, maybe why might that create some issues? So sexualizing a non-sexual environment, asking to objectify people in class, it might be too personal. Some are not ready to come out. This is really personal, could offend. So these were the kinds of things that happened. I mean, in that same class, I think I was asked on a quiz to answer whether I would prefer to be married in a church, a chapel, or a cathedral, or something like that. And I was like, so there's so many questions, right? About like, what is marriage? What is dating? Well, like, how does sexual orientation and gender play into this? Things that were kind of, there were assumptions possibly, right, going on. And again, somebody, probably the teacher, thought this is going to be a fun activity. This is going to be a way that we can have people relate to each other and like think about somebody they know, and it's, you know, personal and fun, because then it's relatable, right? And it's not just some abstract thing. So we might think certain things pedagogically, then miss other ones, right? And I would say in both of these examples and activities, you had to move around the room. And so just thinking about physical mobility might come up. That didn't come up for me necessarily in either of those scenarios, but it's something that, you know, there's this, we're never going to be perfect, and perfection is its own problem. But I think that, you know, that there are always these factors and considerations when I think of like activities that we're going to do. And, you know, some activities may work for certain groups, and some of them you may need to adapt or not do based on the group and what's going to work. I think trying to design things more universally is always helpful, but sometimes we have to be ready to be flexible or adapt. What if the power goes out? What if, a lot of what ifs, right? Things can happen, and we have to just try to figure out to do the best that we can in that scenario. All right. So I'm going to jump now back into the intent versus impact and ask you a bit more about what you think about some of these, and really just put this into a Jamboard here. What we're going to do is I'm going to share the screen so you can also see what, in case you're not able to open the link and go to the Jamboard, and also so we get it in the recording here. But what I'm asking you to do, there's going to be two slides. One says intent and one says impact. You could make sticky notes. I'm asking you just to not cover up other people's or change the title on the slide. But there's a tool that says sticky note, and it looks like a little square with two lines on it. And you can pick a color, whatever color you want is fine. But for each of these slides, if you can come up with one or two things, I'm asking you, really, what is intent or what is impact, and why or how does it matter? So really just a few words that you think answer some of that question. So what is it, and why, how / does it matter? It doesn't have to be an essay, but a few words will be helpful here. So basically, if you can do at least one per each of these two slides, one about intent and one about impact, that will be helpful. So as you're doing that, I'm going to read some of them off. So the question again was like, you know, what is it, and how or why does it matter, or does it matter? So intention was your goal, how we hope a behavior or statement will be received, what you want to accomplish or communicate. Intention is the driving force behind your actions. It matters because it stirs your direction. What we want to happen, or getting the impact we want, we have control. Intent is what you believe the goal or objective of your action is. It's the true meaning behind your words and actions. Wanting to show power, maybe marginalize someone else as a possible intention. I guess if for those that are still making stickies for this page, are there you know, reasons why you think intention matters or doesn't matter in certain scenarios? Or how does it matter? Why does it matter? And if you've finished on this page about intention, if you want to add some things on the impact page, I will read some of those in a moment. So one person wrote that intention does matter, it may cause harm. Sometimes it feels like it's used as an excuse. That's not what I meant. And maybe it's not. but that doesn't always help the scenario. I'm going to look at what some folks are putting under impact so far. So again, the question is, what is it? But also, why does it matter or not matter? How does it matter? Does it matter? So for impact, what actually happens? It is out of our control. We cannot make something have the impact we intended. It matters because impact is deeply personal and we need to keep others in mind. Another person also wrote, we have a bit less control over this, but we carry the responsibility for the impacts of our actions. How others interpret your actions, how a person receives or reacts to a behavior or statement. It's the result, intentional or not. I think I'm going to pull us out of the slide share here and maybe have us go into some smaller group conversations for just a few. It will be brief, but just a few moments, and to go a little bit deeper with this. So I do want you to think about, why does this matter? And here's what I had started with sort of earlier in this session, is that in many of these cases, especially when we're talking about if somebody is expressing that they've been harmed, if they're saying this has not been an inclusive experience for me, how do we react to some of that? I think in many of these cases, it's about centering impact. I do want to say before we go into this conversation, there are lots of reasons that intention matters. I don't necessarily think it's the thing to lead with when we're trying to address what somebody is saying about impact. But I know that from a spiritual level, I think that it matters, but I don't think it matters always to have to explain intention or to defend by explaining intention. And I say that because some of the ideas about intent versus impact actually come out of legalism, and legalism has also been critiqued, right, as part of sort of larger colonial or oppressive structures at times. And so I bring that up because impact is part of where some of this conversation about intent versus impact comes from, is also the questions of like disparate treatment versus disparate impact. Right? And so some of this is out of like non-discrimination law and the ways that we're thinking about, well, you can treat everyone the same, but some people are going to have worse outcomes. Some of that is honestly because we've designed structurally, right, policies that are not helpful. I guess everyone's pronouns. Okay, well, you're treating everyone equally by guessing their pronouns, but that leads to a disparate impact, right? So it's that kind of thinking. So I just wanted to bring up that's a little bit of some of the history, I think, of why we're talking about intent versus impact, is that some of that comes out of anti-discrimination frameworks. But also that I think, for me, at least personally, intention can matter a lot. But what I'm asking you to discuss as we go into this breakout is, why would we center impact? How do we center impact? And how could centering or leading with intent possibly backfire? So I'm going to put those questions into the chat before we go into the breakout. And I think that we'll probably do 3 groups here so that they're relatively small. You're only going to have a few minutes, though, to discuss. So those are the questions, and then we'll debrief a little bit when we come back. So, of course, the prompts, to start were really, why center impact? How do we center impact? How could centering or leading with intent backfire? And I sort of peppered in another one in the broadcast, which is really like, how do you recover from a mistake? And maybe what tips do you have for each other around recovering from mistakes? So I want to open it into a larger discussion here and see if anybody wants to share something back from your small group discussion or takeaways that you're having or thoughts you're having about some of those prompts.
So I think what our group was saying, we don't apologize. What we say, because the apology is about us, and what we do is turn it around to the other person and say, be empathetic and say, I care about your reaction. I'd like to know more about it.
Okay. So especially if we're not sure what's happening in a scenario, and sometimes it's been suggested, you might say, well, thank you. Thank you for trusting me to tell me that this wasn't working for you or that this hurt. At least there's an acknowledgement without having to be like, it's all about me. So like, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And then it becomes, okay, is it about the impact or is it now about me being sorry, right? And I think there's plenty of reasons that you could be sorry and say that you're sorry, and that's totally fine. But I think having that cognizance that you're not diverting the attention totally away from the person and what's happening. So thank you for that. I think Michael has a comment or point.
I like how you called it a mistake, but we should be able to learn from our mistakes. So I do think if you have your actions or words have offended someone, it's important to understand why they offended someone so that you don't make that mistake again. So it is important, I think, there are two people with responsibilities here. The person who committed the mistake and the person who took offense or who was affected by the mistake. I think it's partly their responsibility to sort of explain to that individual, this is why what you said or did bothered me. And it needs to be done in a positive manner, but I think it still needs to be done if the person committing the act understands why. Because if they don't understand why, they will continue to commit that same mistake.
Right. So here we're thinking a bit about restorative and transformative approaches, right? What do you want the outcome of this interaction to be? This interaction of there was an issue, something came up. And so where does the learning happen? I think some of the question is, where does the burden for learning happen as well? And where does the energy for some of that come from? It can be helpful if something happened to me and I'm like, that didn't rest right with me. That didn't sit well. I need to talk to this person. I might explain to them. I might share with them some resources. But I also feel a bit like it's their responsibility also to be curious, right? That curiosity might be that they need to go to Google and read a few things or some other place to find resources and not only like ask me 1,000 questions, right? Because then that can quickly become an invalidation as well of like, I'm not really hearing you, I'm just making you defend your point. So there's always some like tough sensitivity. I don't suggest there's a singular way to respond. I'm just adding a little bit of texture into some of the thoughts that we might have as we think about somebody brought this to me. Is my first thing going to be, tell me why, tell me how that you're experiencing that, tell me what I should do better. Yes, those might be questions, but how do I frame them in a way that starts with acknowledging that you're bringing it to me, understanding that like this was important, that you felt that you could bring it to me, and maybe I have some initial thoughts of how I would learn more about it, and maybe I can say, so I'm thinking this. So I'll give you an example is, I'm not saying I do this perfectly, but I mentioned that I have a website, mypronouns.org. I've had several email communications, and I don't know that any of them have gone perfectly, but people have approached me about certain concerns they had with my website. The first in a series of concerns was somebody said, well, I really like your website and I really like the diversity of the imagery on your website that you've used for different photos, but there's no visible representation of a person with a disability. Can you do something about that? And so I looked around and I tried to like find a photo. I thought this was a good bit of feedback. I was really trying to make a visually diverse representation, and that did seem like a gap in something that I care about. But also like, I don't really, I'm sort of like, I don't really know. I go to like stock footage and try to find things. And, some communities are so underrepresented that there's very little that you can find. And I really wanted it to be more intersectional than just like a white cis dude with a disability that's visible. I wanted something that was different from that. So I did find something, and it was a person in a wheelchair, maybe shaking hands with another person. And I showed it to the person who asked me, right? So I did my own research, but then I showed it to the person who brought it up. And I said, what do you think of this if I were to use this image? And they seemed like, cool, great, thanks for being responsive to my concern. A few weeks later, I get an email from a different person who says, I noticed that you had this image on your website of this person using this wheelchair, but it appears to not actually be somebody who uses a wheelchair in real life. Because look, I found all this stock photo of the same person not using a wheelchair, and also the wheelchair is not really fitted properly to them. It looks more like a hospital wheelchair. And so it feels like an inauthentic representation. This is a different person, right? And so they came to me with this, and I was like, okay. And of course I'm feeling a little bit tired, right? Because on the one hand, I like care a lot, and on the other hand, I'm like, oh, I thought I did the thing right. And so I went and I did more research, and I found a people of color with disabilities like group that create stock footage, that's part of what they do. And they had these like non-binary, trans and queer representation of disabled people of color. And so I found an image that I thought would maybe be better than this like big company stock footage. And I again showed it to the person and said, what do you think of this? And they said, that seems good. So I put it in, I followed the captioning guidelines. I followed the like how to give credit guidelines for the organization I used the image from. And then a few weeks later, I get another email from a totally different person who's like, your caption says disabled people. And, I think that you should say person with disability. Now, the trickiness of that one is at the end of that day, I went and had some conversations, right? I said, because I'm sitting there thinking, I've heard this both ways, right? And I'm trying to respect that the website I took this from said disabled, not person with a disability. That is what they said on the website. So I went back, I looked, and then I had consultations with people that do activist work around disability communities to try to check in, because this was also a person who's saying, I have a disability and I'm offended by it. So this is kind of like, it's tricky, right? Because I think that there's sort of no real good answer to some of that. It's valid that one person wants it one way and one person wants it another way, but I can't in some ways please both without maybe finding an image that I don't have to credit, which I wasn't able to do. And it seemed like a perfectly fine image. What I ultimately did in the situation was I added a note to the caption that this was the languaging of the organization that it came from, and that, some people use person first language, some people use identity first language, and that both of those are basically valid. But that this was acknowledging where it came from. So that's just one example of a lot that can come up, right, in sort of an impact scenario in a conversation. With that, after my long story, I'm going to go to Potiti, who has a hand up.
Yeah, in fact, I had my hand up on this question, and then what you talked about perfectly illustrated the situation, because I'm thinking in your example, the people who wrote to you had the impact, but you also had the impact because you also went through ups and downs and everything else because you were worried about the impact of your statement, right? So there's impact on both sides, but we seem to be only focusing on the impact on one side. What about the impact on you?
So I would say, well, impact can be everywhere, but I think that in some of what we're talking about is having a sense of a power analysis, that there are some groups that have more power in these scenarios and some groups that have less power. I might be exhausted, right? But I also decided to put up this website. And so I have some responsibility towards it as something that I've created. I also don't really identify as having a disability, right? I've sometimes been in a liminal edge of a community, but it's not my identity. And I know that that's an identity / status that is highly marginalized, right, in the world. And so in my mind, yes, also I'm trans, also I'm a person of color. Not all the people asking me these things were. And so there were other dynamics going on in some of the way, well, particularly in the way some of them phrased what they were doing or how they approached me that felt like an identity dynamic. So yes, I would say there can be complicated scenarios where there are multiple marginalizations and intersecting marginalizations that happen on both multiple sides or multiple parties in a situation. But for me, what I have to remember is impact isn't just about I'm uncomfortable. Like, you're going to be uncomfortable if somebody says you've made a mistake, or I don't like what you're doing, or this is harming me. You're going to feel like, well, hopefully you will feel like I didn't want that, right? Like, you know, but then how do I be more comfortable with being uncomfortable? That is, I think, a constant question that needs to be asked as we do diversity, equity, inclusion work, because I think that if we are so fragile that we completely fall apart if somebody has a criticism or a concern, because I think that the reality of, like, you know, to the restorative, to the transformative, to the how do we learn from this, is it's about coming back again and again, and coming back to what are our deepest values, what do we care about? And that is why I said that I also think intention matters. It may not matter in having a discussion about somebody's harm and about what has impacted them, but it really matters, I think, when it comes to what motivates me to care and to try to do better and to try to come back and come back again, even through all the brokenness that can happen in the world. So that's how I view that, is that it's complicated, but I always want to remember that there is a power dynamic and lens to it, and that these things aren't just individual, right? I'm sure that in other sessions you all have had this week, you've talked about institutional and structural racisms and power and oppression, that it's not just the, like, interpersonal dynamic, but, you know, for example, when somebody uses the wrong pronoun, it might, you know, feel a certain way because that happened to me 3 times earlier this day. It might trigger something in me about, like, a traumatic thing that's happened in the trans community or in my own life. But also it relates to the fact that, like, government forms erase me. But why do government forms erase me? Colonialism, right? Like, there's actual anti-sodomy, anti-queer laws that have been around for hundreds of years that were often implemented through British colonial law and other kinds of colonial laws. And you go back and you look at the testimonies and documents, witness statements from the 1600s, and people were disgusted, you know, people coming from a colonial you know, viewpoint were basically like, I don't like that I'm seeing gender and sexual diversity, and let's erase it, basically. And then we instituted all these laws that did, right? We instituted laws that put people in prison for their gender or sexual variation, whether it was same-sex activity, or even in the 1800s in the US was like anti-cross-dressing laws, things that just started popping up all over the place. So there's a lot that happens on the, like, legal structural level too. And so I don't want to forget all those analyses when we think, well, I'm being impacted. Okay, but, like, how does that relate to kind of what also is happening culturally, societally, and institutionally, and remembering that there are many different lenses for this. We're kind of at the end here. I really appreciate all the interactivity. This has been an amazing group. I would say, you know, as we close out, you know, we talked a bit about how that you might recover from a mistake, or how that you might apologize, things to think about, avoid, do, not do. It really is an art, and it really is personal too, on the level that we each interact in different ways. Our own style and approach might be slightly different, but there might be some grounding principles, right? And things to continue to think about. What I'd ask you to do as we sort of wrap up in this space is maybe share one thing in the chat that was a takeaway for you, or something that sparked a thought for you, or an additional good practice or tip that you want to share with others before we leave this space. And I'll read out some of those and we'll close there. And one person sharing, my daughter, 11, recently met someone who has they, them pronouns. She took it completely in stride and uses the correct pronouns easily. It gives me hope. And another person wrote, centering impact. That was powerful. Some folks are talking about Dr. Green's video from, I think, earlier this week. So that about repair and recovery. One person says, I like the concept of centering the impact. Another talked about showing empathy versus being defensive. Searching for images and resources from groups who are doing this work rather than image search in Google, right? Creating a safe space for students to share impact, that the group work is helpful. And there's trauma and history at play always. Well, great. I really appreciate y'all taking the time out to continue with these kinds of conversations. I know this is only a tip of a much larger conversation, but thank you. Thank you so much for having me and for being here today.
Thank you, Shige. We so appreciate you. We absolutely appreciate you. Thank you for being here and generating this discussion for our faculty. I know that all of the people that are here have students and classrooms, so it'll continue to have a positive impact, everything that you've shared. We're grateful for you. Awesome. Take good care, all.
Thank you.
Have a great day.